my name is Kelly Gray, and I'm the project lead on the Moshereum, which is the 3D virtual art gallery featuring the art of Professor Mike Mosher. I worked with Professor Mosher and Kevin Kargula and a few other members of the Virtual Reality Research Group at Saginaw Valley State University to create the Moshereum in 2015, finishing up in early 2016, exhibited at the Cyberspace Art Exhibition and also at the Michigan Academy of Science, Arts, and Letters conference in 2016. We developed the Moshereum with very little experience in anything involving 3D modeling, 3D animation. I had just started taking my first programming courses, so I didn't really know anything about that either. And we had no budget. We had no real money to speak of or anything like that. So how do you develop a project involving 3D, virtual reality, and art when you have very sparse skill sets in different areas? Well, in this video, we won't get into detail on every single hurdle that we faced, but we will look at some of the conversation that happened between myself, the project lead, and Professor Mike Mosher, which was the artist whose vision was creating this universe. So, without further ado, let's take a look at this conversation that happened through the concept art and through the builds that were pretty much the conversation as it went along. Places that we started at the beginning, we ended up in a really similar place, and I think for the most part our final iteration was I think we were both very happy where things ended up. But early on, this was my first part of the conversation that I started with Mosher, throwing some ideas that I had into a 3D space so we could see what worked and what didn't, and start to refine things further. So the first thing we start off with is looking at a placard, which tells the user who you know what this program is, who you are, that kind of stuff. A lot of this is in place of any kind of user interface, because this is a really easy way. I found that, for one, I wasn't really super familiar with user interfaces and development of user interfaces, and although it didn't feel like it was too difficult to figure that out, there was also the added element of what is the proper user interface for VR. This is a sensibility that we haven't really, I don't know if there's a standard that everybody can really attach to, because there isn't one determined way that seems to work the best. So I seem to think that having an in-universe way of conveying information is probably the best, i.e. having a placard or a television screen or signs, the actual physical within the universe signs. And you'll see a lot of that coming through later. Seems like a very low-cost way of doing things, and it seems to make sense for the user. It just adds to the immersion. So, and we start the user off in a smaller room, and this is a trend you'll see in a lot of my work, that we start the user off in a very confined space. This is actually a little bit bigger than I normally would start with, but anyways, the whole idea is to start them off in a little bit more confined space and then open them up as things go on. And if you start things off from a musical perspective, if you start off with things in piano, then it's very easy to go to a mezzo forte, and that'll have an emotional impact, and you don't need to get loud. So anyways, we come out here into the first room, and we were looking at what I was considering like a comic book type shop. And of course I put the placard here to explain that, this would be kind of like a gift shop, comic book shop. You could put mannequins with clothing, you could stock different types of elements on the shelves and things like that. This is just one use of the space, possibly. And we didn't end up going with this exactly. We went with a comic book shop in a later build that ended up sticking around to the end. But it was a completely different feel, which you'll see in later elements. But anyways, you come through the opening area, and this is, I wanted to have some kind of opening to the outside world so that you would know. Now obviously there's nothing really going on in either one of these, you just see a checkerboard floor. This would have been filled in later if we stayed with it, but this is just a proof of concept anyways. So it illustrates that the user is to be aware that there is a world outside of this, so then everything maybe becomes bigger in their cognitive space. So then we come into the first open area, and if you look around this room, you will see a lot of elements that we find in the academic center in the final build, which is the first big room that houses a lot of Mosher's work, and you'll see. And a lot of elements ended up sticking around. Now I use this just as a early demonstrator of different types of materials, and I was expecting Moshe was going to pick one or two of these materials and really run with it and really attach to it, because I knew I had my favorites. But he didn't do that. He wanted to do all of these, and eventually we kind of like narrowed it down to maybe not all of these different material types, but a lot of them ended up, and he'd figured them in with the type of art piece that he would put on the material would be symbolic in itself. So it ended up being actually very useful for the artist to figure out like what kind of material do you even display your art on, and you'll see this become more of a theme later. But as you can see, I hoisted a few of his pictures up just to give him just a basic idea. This is kind of the way I figured an art gallery would be set up in a virtual space. If money were no object, and you could make any objects you want, any material you want, kind of. As you can see, I fell in love with the normal mapping, and normal mapping is, without getting into the high jargon, but normal mapping allows 2D surfaces to have the impression of having 3D depth, like these bricks. Now, this is strictly a 2D plane, but it looks like the light glints off it, and that kind of stuff was it's so easy to do in Unreal Engine, and it was one of my favorite effects. So I was thinking he was going to go with more of these, but he ended up really attaching to the hardwood and the metal walls, like these over here, which are supposed to simulate gold and steel and things of that nature. So I wanted to again start to get people to think outside the realms of normal art. As much as we would confine them within a normal art world, we wanted them to open. This is a door that was from a prior project, yay. And I wanted them to think about scale a little differently, and think about when you're creating the art, you can create it to be blown up or shrunk down, and of course this just illustrates that. I want to make sure I tell the person that forcing perspective and scale, these things are things that you can do in VR with high effectiveness, but you have to be very aware of that too. But that's a whole different sensibility that we would get into at another time. You can see a little bit of Z fighting down here. So obviously you can see this is a very rough proof of concept, but it was just to try to get the conversation started between me and an artist, which we had never done anything in before. So all right. So the conversation continued, and this time it involved Moshe speaking to me through some of these concept art pieces that he drew up. And although you may have difficulty like I did reading a few pieces of his handwriting, you can clearly see a lot of the elements that he's going for and how he's really looking at the scale and really looking at putting people inside of different types of art, using the surreal nature, the fact that you can put somebody in a floating platform without any supports, which would be impossible in real life, but in our virtual world, completely possible. And you can see a lot of elements in even these initial drawings make it into the final copy. For example, at the top you see that floating room. Almost every single room of the Moshereum ended up being a floating room, much like that. You see the two people looking up at the wall full of pictures. You see some elements of this, but we had decided against having a lot of these pictures because the first two row of pictures at the top, you really wouldn't be able to see much, I would be afraid. So we ended up opting for a couple different ways of displaying images on a large scale, which you'll see in the final build. Of note also, you'll see the meter that he has on the right side of this first concept art, how it was circular in nature, and how I understood what he was going for. He was kind of wanting somebody to be in that meter, to be an art gallery of itself. And I quickly veered him away from from the circle aspect. I asked him if there was any way we could do the meter in a square nature, just because I knew the constraints of how VR, especially when we were first developing this, how it was really cutting edge PCs that were even going to be able to handle VR, and if we were talking about a large scale room that was set in a circular pattern, it was either going to be a very poor representation of a circle with very rough edges, or it was going to be a very nice representation of a circle, and it was going to really make any system that we put it on drag. So I asked him if there was any way we'd go square, and you'll find in the final build that our final room was a square meter that you enter into for the final gallery. The second piece of Moving on to the second piece of concept art, we see a lot of elements that do indeed make it into the final build. Starting with the top, he's discussing the different paintings on different materials like we had discussed before. Going to the middle left, you see the semiconductor shape as a gallery. That exact image became a blueprint that I used to design one of the 3 primary galleries in the Moshereum. So you see that that element hopefully faithfully be illustrated in the final build. And you'll see in the bottom right hand side dominated by that large square meter that you would enter into for a gallery. And of course he has some ideas of having the paintings on the outside, and the outside itself, the meter's outside skin being the art gallery, which we don't end up doing that way, but there's a unique spin on that too that we kind of come back to. The third piece of concept art, we see again this square meter start to take shape with the other way of looking at it that I ended up really attaching to, which was the meter, for all intents and purposes on the outside, looks to be the appearance of a normal meter. Once you enter through the meter face, once you see the inside of the meter, then that's where you see the art happening. And of course, you can take what you will from there, but I felt that I think we both felt that spoke a lot more to the feeling we were going for with the piece. So after a little bit of concept art and the conversation going back and forth that way, Moshe and I met again in person, which we'd been meeting in person throughout this entire process, but when we met in person this time, he also expressed to me that when he wanted that floating room, when he drew that picture, part of the reason why is because he really struck home with the idea that he wanted that very surreal feeling. He wanted this feeling that this could not exist in the real world, no matter what kind of money or what kind of ingenuity you had. The laws of physics would not allow this to be made. So we talked for a little while before the next build was made. And this was, of course, as you can see on the screen, this is our second build, and this is me reaffirming in the build notes that this is our attempt at a bit more abstraction. Now again, I want to bring note of the placards used in this case. I'm using it not only as a way to communicate with the user, but kind of in a way to communicate with myself, because here I am, a year and a half later or so, and looking at this, and this is reminding me exactly what I was working on. Now, a little bit of a nerd in me appreciates this scene that I start the user off looking at. Not only do you have the placard telling you what information is going on, but I have as it's a work in progress, I have a janitor's cart, a trash can that is not working properly, that's why it's completely black, and a sea of water that ends into infinity. I guess that kind of fits this initial message. So, as we move on, we see a couple elements that I was really pushing home. I knew that we discussed the idea of comics, and Moshe had really gotten into comics before, and he produced comic book series and done a lot of this kind of work before in the past, and so he sent me a couple of ideas. And he really would like to and had some way of pulling up the comic book and flipping through it, and honestly, this is completely doable within the engine and the system, but I was not very good at doing anything like that, and if I could, it would have not been in a quick enough iteration that we could have really moved forward with the project on a timely way. So instead, we opted to have a couple of comics here, and to showcase, I just put a lot of his pieces of work on the shelves to show what it would be if you had a fake shop here as the comic book shop at the university. Later on, we ended up going with, instead of focusing too much on Mosher's work, we also opened it up to the Comic Strippers Club, which is a student organization on SVSU's campus that deals with making comic books, and we had a couple of their artists featured, which you'll see in later builds as well. So, as we move on, we see this is something, again, I brought it up during the first build, but screens are an easy way for somebody like me that is working on a very shoestring budget to convey information to the user, whether it be through placards or signs or television screens and videos and that kind of thing. So so you'll see these screens around because I was planning on these being places where we would speak directly to the user, or have a bit of exposition if we decided to have mini stories somewhere in this experience, which that again shows how I wasn't exactly sure where we were going to end up. So I was just leaving a lot of openings to see which one Moshe wanted to go down first. So then we come out into the world, and I felt that this kind of universe definitely gave way to the feeling of a bit more abstraction. This wall floating in the middle of nowhere with two larger-than-life pieces of art, a huge silo appearing thing in the middle of nowhere, nothing but water as far as the eye can see. Thought this looked very impossible. To fast forward ahead to later builds, after Moshe and I talked about this, he really liked the way these walkways felt, and he really liked these posters on the side, but he didn't like the fact that these things were rooted in the ground, the fact that these had actual what seemed to be like columns that were going down into the water. He said that seemed very normal, that seemed very like this could exist in the real world, and he was pushing again for a very surreal feeling. So you'll see later on, any rooms that we have don't quite have the support, except for one, which I fought for that, but that's another story. But as we go on, we see a couple pieces of his art, and I wanted to really look at the first couple pieces of art that are standing surreal next to the walkway are just there, and they're exactly kind of where eye level would be. I was kind of, ideally here, this would be, your eye would be pointing kind of right at the focal point of the painting in these cases. And I may not have been exactly right on this, but that's what I was aiming for. And I will point out that through the second walkway there's art, and I'm trying to do something just a little bit different and evolve this concept just a little bit more. So, anyways, we come into the first room, and this ends up being the room that houses the transistor later. And I didn't realize how important the transistor symbol was to the whole element of this piece. So I didn't put that in just yet. So this room is a little bit more abstract, with pieces of art scattered about in a seemingly random fashion. And of course there's a screen there that we would talk to the user as they were walking through this room. And of course you can do whatever you want with the walls to make it a little bit more abstract looking. And this is an interesting concept that I like, that I wish we would have had more time to do with, and I will let you look here. This is a forced perspective example, where ideally it would be a small hole that the user would have to like lean forward to be able to look out, and then when they lean forward they would see a huge painting off in the distance. And I'm not sure that this really does the trick, but it kind of, again, it's just here to illustrate proof of concept, which these engines, Unreal Engine, Unity, engines like that are really good for proof of concept type work. Another screen, a small sculpture that just came with Unreal Engine, and on we go to the final room. Now, this walkway, as you can see, I started doing something a little bit different with the art. Now I put it so that you could see that painting that normally you could only see through the wall. Now you can see it a little bit more directly. It's right there in your line of sight, and you can see how big that painting was that you were looking through and seeing at a distance before. But also, once the user would move in that direction and look in that direction, then their eyes would be drawn downwards, and they would see this painting hovering below the platform, almost in a place where it's daring you to find it. Like it's not putting itself in your path. You have to look off the normal visual path to find this piece of art. And you'll see some elements of things like that in later builds as well. But this final room is, I found one painting of Moshe's that I really attached to, especially for this virtual reality project. And I decided that the final room, I was really going to just highlight that one piece of art, because it was something I just felt something with it. So this is where we get to the final room, and you see the piece of art that I really appreciated in somewhat of a reverent place with fires around it, almost like it's a part of some kind of ceremony or something of that nature, with stairs that lead up to it, almost like it's on a stage. But yeah, I just did this to throw it out there and see if Moshe liked it or disliked it or anything like that. And it turns out that he really appreciated it. He wanted to do a little bit more with that final room, which you'll see in final editions. But yeah, this some very basic version of this ended up making it to the final build, and I couldn't be happier, because I really like this picture. So there you go. In looking at one of the final pieces of concept art between Moshe and myself, you see a very distinct map of what the final layout of the Moshereum ends up becoming. And I'm very proud to say that, given this concept art, the final version is very faithful to this, and down a lot of the details even are precisely what Mosher was looking to do with it. Obviously, we had to make some changes here and there, and I was able to convince him to allow me to throw in some colorful additions here and there. But overall, this is pretty true to what we have for the final copy. The three separate rooms, the academic center, the transistory, and the femininometer, are clearly defined, with the gray room being an excellent intro area, the transistory being properly laid out like the circuit that he wanted it laid out, the meter face being exactly what you walk through to get into the final gallery, and then also I got to throw in a couple of the touches that I liked, like that final gallery having the piece of art that I attached to early on in the project. And yeah, you can see clearly that there were a lot of changes from the beginning to this final concept art, but also a lot of solidifying of earlier nebulous, more abstract things that now were allowed to become solidly surreal, but less abstract and more defined, so they could have perhaps more of a root inside of this virtual, slightly insane universe. So in this build you'll find we're pretty close to our final version, and right off the bat I'll point out that you'll see a gun. That's the default gun that comes in the Unreal Engine editor, and I left it in there for myself and a couple of other team members to kind of play with while we were going through the builds. It's just a joke. This is the only build that you'll see makes it through to any kind of copy version. So, but you'll see a lot of elements of the final build making it into this, including this opening area, like I liked having very closed in, and you'll remember I mentioned that starting the user off in maybe not a very, very tight place, but in a familiar, comfortable, like an office or a bedroom or something of that size where you feel very cozy. And then slightly starting to open them up using some glass and different levels was something I was working for here. Different levels, different light levels. Again, having an outside that the user can actually see, that know that they're a part of something, they're not just in a box. And then continuously opening the user up into more and more open areas, giving them a little bit more freedom where they can look out the window. Oh, look, there's trees and there's water, and I think I see a hint of a picture over there. And still keeping this comic book idea. So, you see, this is very close to what we have in the final copy. We eventually just get rid of this whole comic book store idea and move that fully into another room that is off of the academic center. So, we have an idea of mine that I'd had a long time ago that I eventually implemented into this, and that is a glass hallway. And now, a glass hallway on a long period like this doesn't sound like much, but I had a feeling that if you had a program that had really good refractory abilities, like Unreal Engine does with their glass, then if you made a glass hallway and you put art just on the other side of the glass, that it would have this weird feel that as you move forward, the doorway would appear to get smaller and smaller, and it would kind of play this trick with your mind a little bit. And it ended up working beautifully, and different users that went through it had different experiences, but each of them said that it was an interesting, fun feeling, that it wasn't uncomfortable, so I consider that a small win, and it stayed to the final copy. But without further ado, I'll walk you through it and see. Yeah, so that little tiny effect right there, when you're in VR and you're looking around, it's a good combination of feeling suspended, feeling like you're floating, but also feeling kind of closed in at the same time. So it was a unique kind of situation. We also see the fleshing out of the world around starting to become more and more apparent. There are no land masses. You can clearly see the edge of the world, the corner there. But either way, again, this is still very early on for us. We weren't too worried about those kind of details like that. So now we have the academic center. That this is a collection of different models that I have used from different royalty-free projects and just mashed together as best as I can to make it look very official and noble and try to be a little bit imposing, make the user feel a little bit small compared next to this wall. And then when they come in, then we find Mosher's paintings arranged mainly kind of how we liked. We ended up moving a lot of these around later because they weren't all exactly kind of how we wanted them. So, but we did our best in this early copy. Now you'll see this horse floating in the middle of nowhere. That is really not important to the final build at all. That is a placeholder. As the person that does the population of all the items, I use that as a placeholder, knowing that something is supposed to go here and it's not supposed to be this cartoon horse. Well, not usually. So then we find the entrance to Wortman's Comics. Like I said, we end up making a separate comic book shop where, if you come up here, this is where we're in the process of moving everything over. And this room is very, very, very similar to what ends up in the final copy. Same dimensions and same kind of walls and everything, just we end up doing the layout a little bit differently. So, oh, and these walls are made out of water. So then we finally move to the final, the bridge to the second room, sorry, the transistory. But on our way there, we see one of the paintings made as large as the side of a building. And I thought this would really kind of put the user in unique perspective, that maybe they would be alongside these people, maybe with them, maybe afraid of them, who knows, but interesting nonetheless, I thought. So. We get to the transistory, and this room really started to take shape. I found a couple of really good architectural models of these large buildings and columns that I thought would work really well for what we were doing here, and Moshe agreed, and we ended up going with it. Made some changes here and there, and I threw some things in here to try to populate the level, give it a little bit of life, and all of these models were things that I found free in other royalty-free and open source projects that other artists were just happy to be able to help, and things of that nature. So thank you again for everybody that makes your stuff open source. You the real MVPs. So you see the transistor layout is not as readily apparent to anybody walking in the room, but it's there nonetheless. So we have this forced perspective again, and it works a little bit better in this, but without being able to lean down with a VR headset with a static head placement, the way it is right here with a mouse and keyboard. It doesn't work as well, but you get a basic feel for, like, you know, there's a mountain with trees and painting off in the distance. So then we move on to the final room. Now, this was an idea that Mosher had to begin with, of having the face of it have that picture, which I think, I don't remember whose idea it was, but we ended up going completely different and using an actual meter face here. I think some of the problems were it was hard to find a meter face that was high enough resolution that we could use, that was, you know, royalty free and things like that. So, but we ended up working out just fine. Of note also, this walkway, I was going for, I found this walkway and kind of put together a bunch of different pieces to make this walkway, because I figured this would be like a statement in itself of it's kind of breaking down heading up to the meter, but that kind of went in the face of what Moshe was going for, so we instead opted for a very clean, modern looking walkway that goes up to the final meter. This statue, we ended up, I threw this in because I thought Mosher would enjoy the complete absurdity of having a giant horned statue here out of nowhere, and he did, and he wasn't sure about it holding this picture like this. He didn't like this, so we ended up changing a couple things, and you'll see the final copy. This picture still exists, the statue still exists, but it's in different places. But yes, it all works out in the end. And then finally, you enter into the Femininimeter, and we see a very similar scene to what we saw before, which is the prominent piece of art looking right at you with a seeming ceremony almost happening around it. And as you look down, you see it's almost as if there are church pews that are in disarray. So it adds that feeling of reverence and slightly falling apart, but still of use. There are a lot of these thematic elements. That's just my interpretation of it as well, and I would think that myself and most people in my position are trying to let the artist speak and leave it otherwise intentionally ambiguous for the viewer. I can put a few things in here or there, but my interpretation is just my own. And if you see something different when you look at these pieces of art, when you see something completely contradictory, that's neither right nor wrong. That's the wonderful thing about art.